You can view the video of this podcast on Jazz Cabbage's YouTube or Facebook pages.
But Bob Miller has joined us from ACT Labs, and Jeff Nemeth, who started this with some other people in Michigan, moved out to several states, getting back into the Michigan scene in full force, along with these new changes and everything going on. And just to kind of explain what that is, what was happening before, the testing wasn't being done correctly maybe, or there were things being disregarded, but it's believed to have let some microbial stuff pass that it shouldn't have. And so now there's going to be added stuff. So if you could explain that for us, Bob, I really appreciate it. And then if you could include at some point whether or not this is going to take more time and cost more for people. Hey, welcome to the show too, Bob Miller from ACT Labs.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, so first, yes, thank you. So yeah, I want to share with you sort of the most recent changes that are happening in the state related to microbial testing. And when you look at microbial testing, there's really two distinct parts of it. There's ones that are very specific to specific microbes, and those are specifically three: Aspergillus, E. coli, and Salmonella. And then there's also something called total yeast and mold. So the changes that are occurring right now are really in the space of total yeast and mold. And what happened historically is there was really two different types of testing being done: the traditional plating methodology. And the traditional plating methodology is one by, you essentially take the product, the flour product in particular, you essentially extract the flour and then plate it to see if you have microbial growth. And you're looking at the total amount of yeast and mold in the product. And what had happened over time is there was really two different methodologies that were being proposed, and actually in one particular case, actually certain laboratories in the state were actually approved to do what's called QPCR. So QPCR is very similar to the testing that's done with coronavirus, whereby you're actually determining a DNA sequence and showing that that DNA sequence is the same as the microbial attribute you're testing for. So it's a very, very accurate test when used in a very appropriate way. What had occurred in the state, there were a number of laboratories who said they could do qPCR instead of the traditional plating methodology. And the difference really is cycle time and cost. So the cycle time for qPCR is about a day, and for the traditional plating method, it typically takes 3 days. So that was the major difference. As time evolved, there were a number of people doubting the accuracy of qPCR for total yeast and mold. And what the state decided to do at the urging of a number of laboratories was to bring in an outside expert to evaluate the various types of testing that could be allowed and to be used. And they used a group called AOAC. AOAC, think of it as an independent consortium of government laboratories, but really chemists by trade, but really, the AOAC really stands for the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists. So it was an impartial team that was asked to look at the specific various types to do total yeast and mold and to make a determination about their validity. What they concluded at the end of January is the qPCR method was invalid. And probably the most concerning component of it was that the belief it was underestimating the yeast and mold in the product. So what the state has done, which occurred at the end of January, is they essentially said that as of that date of January 22nd, anyone using qPCR had to cease its operation and use. And then the state has required, until such time that that method would meet the muster of AOAC, which has very strict validation guidelines, you could no longer use that test as the sole test to do total yeast. And in the interim, what has to be done is if you decide to use qPCR, you have to then partner it with one of the other two approved types of methodologies. In the recent change, in the state, and the impact is obviously cycle time, and I would argue more than likely cost, because the cost of consumable materials to do the traditional plating method are more expensive than that for qPCR, but at the same time will be yielding reliable or more reliable results.
Bob, what is the difference in cost between those two tests? They're both existent in Michigan, so we should know the finite cost for those already.
Yeah, I can't speak to what the qPCR test costs because we weren't using the qPCR tests. The traditional plating tests are less than $100 for the test. So I really don't know what the qPCR because we weren't using it.
And that's typically performed on one batch, which is what, 10 pounds of cannabis? Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Is it likely or possible that the other method will meet standards soon enough? Is it close, or is it just a failed system at this point?
Hard to tell. The information that we've gotten and the information I have is the underestimation of the yeast and mold is due to the inability to fully extract the microbes from the plant if they were present. So what the state has said, the AOAC has a rather extensive way on how to validate a method. And what the state has indicated is that if you want to use that method as a standalone method, you would have to meet that set of criteria. But based on what the AOAC has already determined, that would be difficult to achieve without a methodology change. So I think the chances of using it as is pretty low.
A technological logjam at this particular point, then, correct?
Yes. Yes, I think at this point in time, what is really happening is those specific laboratories have to move their operation to either use qPCR if they so desire, as well as the more traditional methodology. So it's really a movement away from those specific types of criteria.
Fascinating. And this is something that has been brewing for a while. Do we know how long AOAC performed their evaluation of the market to determine that the methodology was invalid?
They had spent, what happened at the state level, they'd gotten some anecdotal information over the last few months that there was this report that there was this underestimation of total yeast and mold. So the AOAC about 3 months ago asked each of the laboratories that were performing the various types of tests to provide them data. And I believe they also did some testing themselves, all done in an independent nature. And then they just recently came back with their conclusions, indicating that the qPCR method is an invalid test.
So we're not going to see, or likely not to see, a big price increase, but there will be a time increase now, for sure, just by a matter of necessity of how the testing works.
Yeah, yes, I think that's the case. I think the other thing that is definitely happening in the marketplace is I've been talking about total yeast and mold. As I was mentioning before, there is another test which looks at individual microbes. And in that particular case, there is a single approved methodology today to do those microbes, but you have to marry it up with 2 different tests to do that. And the good news on that one is one company is very, very close to being able to do a PCR-like approach to be able to do that. So the good news on the individual microbe levels, I think we're probably a few weeks away, maybe months away, to being able to do a single test there, but not in total yeast and mold.
And the value of being able to do the single microbe tests, clearly Michigan has a pretty high testing standard already. Would there be additional legislation required to monitor specific microbes or make it mandatory to do so?
No, the state of the regulations today, I do not anticipate will change. It's really what specific methodologies you can do to perform those specific tests. And that's what's really changing, all for the better, to create more accurate, reliable data.
So Bob, I know that, you kind of gave us a few minutes here and really appreciate it. Is there anything else of interest or of importance that you'd like to let everybody know before we move on?
I think at the end of the day, our job, as I look as being the CEO of ACT Labs, is really to generate accurate and reliable data. That's what our job is, and our job will always be that. And really, if there aren't any individual questions about it, we want to make sure that our patients get safe and reliable medicine. So that's very much what we do. This change in the total yeast and mold did not impact us because we were doing it with the plating method. So, if there are any specific questions, I could talk about this, you might imagine, for hours about it. It's a very intriguing topic. But if anybody has any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'd be more than happy to take through where I think it's going. But the technology is moving all to the better. In the future, I think we will have a very reliable test in months and years to come for total yeast and molds. It just was too premature, and therefore really potentially had situations whereby we were using that specific technique, that is, we're underestimating the potential levels of microbes seen in a product.
Bob, just to clarify before we let you go, the plating method you said is approximately $100 per batch, and the QPCR method was less expensive because it was less materials intensive and less time intensive. So someone with the QPCR was paying less than 100 and it's going to just go up to $100. This is not a huge increase in price for a 10-pound batch. I don't think it's legitimate for any retailer or wholesaler to raise pricing because of this. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think that my understanding is it was more the cycle time component than anything else was the impact, right? So you're moving away from a less than a 1-day test to now a 3-day test. That's really the major change.
Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot, Bob, and thanks a lot, ACT Labs. Been a favorite of mine for many years, and we appreciate Jeff and everybody there and the philosophy that you guys bring to the industry. And we'll check in again, hopefully, on some more other issues. And get your
Sure, anytime.
Great information.
Great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay.
That was
Bye-bye.
a great summation of the situation, too.
Yeah,
That was
I agree.